have Sajal Nagwanshi join us today. Sajal has been with Flipkart for over 3 years now and is a senior user researcher working on bringing our next 200 million new customers and more to the platform. He has his Masters of Research. He has his Masters of Design in Interaction Design from IIT Bombay and has worked in user research with brands such as OLX and JioSaavn prior to Flipkart. So, over the next 53 to 50 minutes, we will have Sajal talking to you about the basics of user research and how to build a user-centered product. And through this discussion, he will illustrate 4 different types of user research that are conducted at various stages of product development. He will also share examples of how Flipkart leverage these methodologies in our own product development. I'm super excited. I'm sure you are as well. So without any further ado, I will hand it over to Sajal. Sajal, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Isha, for that introduction and setting up the context. First of all, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining on today evening and joining this discussion on user research. I'm very excited to share with you all the learnings that I've had in past 6 years of doing user research, and hopefully in next 15 minutes I'll be able to share some of the insights that you can take back and apply that on your product itself. All right, and without further ado on this particular aspect, I will now talk about what are the topics that will be covered today and what can you expect by the end of this session. So I would say that if you like stories, then this session is going to be fun for you, because I'm going to share various stories from the field. The first part, which is about can bad design change the world, is about a story that actually influenced me a lot to do user research. So I'll talk about one such case which talks about what is an influence of bad design. The second part is about introduction to user research, where I'll talk about what does it mean to do user research. The next part is how user research and product development go together. And then comes the meat of this whole presentation, where I'll share 3 stories from the field. And with those stories, I'll talk about 3 of the most important methods that are used in user research. And lastly, I'll leave you with some practical tips that you can apply for your own user research. So hopefully by the end of the user research session that we have over here, you will be motivated to conduct your own user research, and B, we'll have practical tips that you can use right off the bat. Okay, having said that, now let's just begin the first part of it. The first part is an interesting story. I don't know how many of you remember the year 2000. That was the year where US elections were taking place, and the candidates who were taking part were Al Gore and George Bush. These were obviously the most prominent candidates back then. It is also supposed to be the most the tightest or the closest US elections ever. And if you don't know, George Bush had won by only 537 votes. That's about 0.009% of margin. That's probably the closest margin that's ever been in US presidential election. And to add some more interesting facts, Al Gore actually won the popular votes, and that's about 5.43 lakhs. So Al Gore in total got 5.43 lakh more votes than George Bush totally. However, George Bush won because he won the electoral college by 271 compared to 261 or 267 by Al Gore. So if you imagine the year 2000 when the election counting was happening, it was so close that Florida state, which was actually the decision-making state, announced for automatic recounting because the margins were so low. And what happened eventually was that there was one particular county which became the decision-making state, and that was Palm Beach County. What happened over there was when the first counting happened, there were about 900 votes margin, which George Bush had got, but the recounting led to much, much closer. But another interesting thing happened, which was that a lot of voters started calling the agency saying that, hey, they made a mistake of voting for someone else. And the mistake was essentially this. So after a lot of investigation, of course, that happened in hindsight. After a lot of investigation, what was found that the Palm Beach County had used something called as a butterfly ballot, which meant the candidate's name was spread out in two sides of the punching zone over here. So the way a person had to vote for a candidate was to punch through these holes. If someone wanted to vote for Republican George W. Bush, that they have to punch the first hole, which is written number 3. And if they wanted to vote for Democratic, it had to be the third hole. However, we all know that we read top to bottom and left to right. So what ended up happening was that people thought in order to vote for Democratic candidate, you have to vote for second because that comes second in this particular list. What happened was they ended up voting for Pat Buchanan from Reform Group. And that led to a huge margin of error or actually a mistake by a lot of people. And through investigation which happened in later years, it was found that this particular county, which was the Palm Beach County, led to fall of Al Gore. And thus we saw the history being written in that way. So if, this report, if you see, it says that if everything else was kept constant, this was the decision-making criteria which led to fall of Al Gore. And thus we had another candidate winning. So you can see how a error on a design of a layout of a ballot can lead to a different government altogether. So this reminds me of a quote which I find very dear to me, which is that if you think good design is expensive, you should look at the cost of bad design. And this is one lesson. So the first time I came across this particular case was 2012. And when I came across this, I realized that yes, a good design does play a big role, and a bad design is far, far more expensive to do. So with having said that and setting that context that why user research is important, and because that leads to good design, we come to the section about the user research. And pause over here and just to get a sense of the participants over here. I want to understand from you all that have you ever conducted user research for your own product? And by user research, I do not mean like a very elaborate one, just as simple that did you reach out to the people that use your product and try to understand what's their feedback? If you ever did that, please vote for that. So there might be a poll which will go out live now. I just request you to respond to that. We'll wait for a couple of more seconds for the results to set in. So what I want to understand is amongst all the participants over here, which just reached 300, I want to know how many of you have actually got first-hand experience of doing a user research on a product that you are building, or if you ever worked on any such product. All right, so I'll move to the next section. So in this particular section, I want to talk about, first of all, formally introducing what user research is, and then talk about what is the purpose of it exactly. So the formal definition is that user research is a systematic study of target user group to understand the problems, behavior, and needs of them, and eventually building product that solves their needs and meets their needs and solves their problem. So what we see over here is there are key points about this definition, which is that user research is always about a target user group. It's not about general population. It's about a target user group. That's one. The second point is that we try to understand people's needs, problems, and behavior, all of those things, and eventually then build a product that would satisfy their needs and solves their problem. So keeping these three things in mind is extremely important. What you see on the right side is a photograph from one of my earliest user research that I did a long time back, almost 5 years back. And this is pretty much how the user research session looks like. So we go into people's environment, their habitats, the homes, or maybe offices, if you are doing that kind of study. We try to understand how they are using a particular product and try to see how exactly they take particular steps in order to achieve their goals. In this particular picture, I was trying to investigate how people listen to music. And it was not just about the app, but also the environment they live in, the posters they put on their walls, the kind of books that they read, the kind of table that they set up with their favorite artist over there, because it's the whole environment, the whole experience of music listening that's important. So do keep in mind that when you're trying to understand users, also understand their context. The second is, why do we do user research? So in my opinion, there are basically two parts to user research, or the two kind of goals to it. The first is to understand users. And when we try to understand users, we look at what are their goals in their life, what are the needs they have, what are the problems that they have in order to achieve their goals, and what are the attitudes and behavior they have in particular domain that we want to understand. That's one. The second is that all that is going to inform us to make better product market fit. What it means is that we build products that will eventually be used by users. So we help that. As user researcher, what I do is when I try to understand user, it helps my stakeholders to take decisions which are more user-centered. B, it reduces the development cost, which means we don't end up making products that are not going to be used by users, or worst, something like a postal ballot, the ballot that we talked about, which ended up making a big, huge error. And lastly, it would increase product adoption or engagement or any other metric that is important for you. So both these things are important. So once you understand user, then you can make a product that will be used by. So that's the more important part of user research. So we spoke about user research, we spoke about product development. In this particular section, I want to talk about how user research informs product development and how they both go hand in hand. So when you're building a product, there are more or less 4 types of questions or 4 stages that you go through. The first stage is when there is no product in hand. It's essentially an idea or maybe just a vision that you have. So the kind of question that you ask is, what should we build? So what should we build and whom should we build this for? So imagine you were to start a finance product, then you would ask that, hey, what kind of product should I build and whom should we build this for? And if you are in that kind of a stage, that's called foundational research. So that's the stage where we call the requirement gathering stage. The second is when you have an idea that what kind of product you want to build, and you want to know whether that idea will work or not. So we do something called as a formative evaluation or formative usability evaluation, where we try to test some concepts and ideas and see will it work for the people or not. Third is when your product is already live and you want to know that how well it is doing, and how can you improve this further. Then you do something called a summative evaluation of benchmarking exercise to see if it can be further improved. And lastly, when you have a stage where you say that maybe there is something which is going wrong, a metric is moving anomalously, then what can you do about it? Right. So these are the 4 kind of research problems that you will always encounter. So when I work day to day with my stakeholders, I try to first identify that which kind of problem am I solving? Because based on that, I can then allocate or select which kind of method will be chosen and how will I execute this. Okay, so just to re-emphasize all these 4 points. The first one is called as foundational research. That is when you are trying to understand an ambiguous problem area. What happens with that is you try to define an ambiguous problem area and define who are the users, what are their needs, what is their behavior and attitude. Second is formative evaluation. This is where you have some ideas, some concepts, and you want to know whether this will work or not. Often what happens is that we go out with a prototype, and I guess you might be already familiar with this, that the prototype is kind of a demo of a product, which might not be completely working or completely functional, but it has some partial functioning of it, so that we can get to refine it quickly. We don't develop it completely. We just refine the prototypes so that we know if it is working well or not. The next comes the summative evaluation or benchmarking. This is done when the product is already live. So you want to know whether the product is working better than past, or it is working better than the competitors. Then you can do a summative benchmarking. And lastly, you do investigative study when you think that some of the metrics are performing anomalously. What do I mean by that? If you launch a product and the NPS went down by significant margin, or maybe the cancellation rates increase, or the return rates increase, or any other product metric that is a concern for you, then you want to understand why that happened. So these are the 4 types of research methods. And if I talk about the whole product lifecycle in Flipkart, this is how it looks like. So I try to put all my experience and my retrospection over this, and this is how the method or the whole product cycle looks like, and where the different kind of research methods come in. So essentially, the product lifecycle can be broken down into 3 parts, which is understanding the problem, finding solution and assessing it, and then development of it. For user research, we contribute a lot in the early phases and the finding solution and assessing solution phase. So at the first stage, which is the foundational research, it aligns a lot with the design thinking framework, which is to identify a problem space, empathize, define a problem, ideating it, and creating a product concept out of it. Once you do that, then you can create a design. By design over here, I mean concepts, prototypes, ideas. You explore it, and we do a lot of formative evaluation. And when we do formative evaluation, it's in multiple iterations. It's not just one prototype, it's multiple prototypes that we evaluate. Then we review it, and eventually that is developed. After doing analytics and maybe A/B testing and experiments, we might do summative evaluation just to see how well it is doing after launch. And if there is a need, we might do an investigative research. So this is the spectrum of the user research methods, the kind of problems that we face, and the whole product life cycle. So this brings me to a quote which I really admire. So James Garrett is one of my favorite designers, and he summarizes this point very well, which is user-centered design means understanding what your users need, how they think, how they behave, and incorporating that understanding into every aspect of your process. And the previous diagram which I showed essentially emphasizes that fact again, which is that user research is not just about doing it before you build the product. It's also while you are building the product, when you have already launched the product, and lastly, after it has been live and there's some problem that you're facing, you keep on doing that. So it's not one-off activity. It's something that will go on at each and every stage. So, okay. So which brings us to a section where I want to just pause for a moment and bring in Isha here. Isha, if you can come over.
Sure. There is a poll up as well right now, Sajal.
Sure.
So we'll just wait for the results to come through. I'm just reading out the question aloud for everyone, which is, have you used any of the following methods to conduct user research? And the options are usability testing, survey, interviews, focus group discussion, diary study, and never done a user research. And we will give it another 30 seconds for people to enter their inputs, and then I will read out the results for you, Sajal. And if you want to comment upon that, or you have any thought on that, that would be great. Just from the previous poll as well, for the benefit of everyone, just wanted to share that 76% said yes, Sajal, and 24% said no. You have any thoughts there? Do you want to respond to that?
No, I'm really happy. I mean, 75%, 74, 75%, almost three-fourth. I think that's a pretty good number to have to start with. I would be really keen to know what the other 24, who the other 24% is, and want to understand why they could not do it. But for all the people who have done this, great. I think that's a great start, and I hope you can take away some important insights from here. And maybe the next time you do user research will be slightly better than what you did before.
Great. Thanks for that response, Sajal. So on the chat window, 80% have participated so far, and the number continues to go up. So I will just read out the results for now, because we've given it some time now. So 14% have chosen usability testing, 26% have chosen survey, 36% have chosen interviews, 8% have chosen focus group discussion, 2% have chosen diary study, and 13% say never done a user research.
Interesting. Sorry, can you read the first one? The usability, was it 11%?
The usability testing is 14%, 26% for survey. Did you get everything else, Sajal?
Yeah, I got everything else. Yeah.
You want to respond to that, and then we'll go to the next section.
Yeah, so one is, I'm very happy that there's a lot of distribution like this, well distribution of different methods. The second is, I anticipated survey to be the top or like at least the second most popular method. And yeah, and I'm glad to see interviews also getting a lot of responses. So I'm really happy to know that. And I just want to give a heads up to all the participants or attendees over here that we are going to talk about at least 3 methods which are highly voted over here. So keep an eye on.
Yeah, there is a lot of interesting conversation happening on the chat window, where some are saying, oh, I would have preferred multiple choice. Some are saying there's no one best method. Some are trying to understand what's the difference between the options. So I love the energy right now in the chat window.
Great.
Okay.
Any questions that we can take up?
Yeah. So Sajal, we'll move to now the Q&A. And there are lots and lots of questions on the chat window. So I will first pick up the most basic and the first one, just to also give a little bit of a first come, first serve there. So Siddhant is asking 2 questions, so I'll club them together. He's saying how to get started with UX research and how to do content and design research separately or together. And Sajal, do you just want to stop presenting for a bit so people can see you full screen? That would be nice.
Sure.
And I will repeat the question again. How to get started with UX research and how to do content and design research separately or together?
Got it. I think great question. So I'll interpret the first question, which is how to get started with UX research, being if you are part of a product team, whether you're a designer, researcher, product manager, then how do you get started? I think the best method to get started is actually reach out and recruit people who are around you. So let's say, so this is one simple method that I had actually started out with, that if you have a product already in your hand, which is live, or even if it is a prototype, just sketch out something if the product does not exist, if you have ideas, and reach out to 5 people who you can see around you. And if they align to the target user group that you already feel like. And the simplest thing is to tell them a task that they can perform on the app. For example, if they're using Flipkart, just ask them, hey, can you shop for a mobile phone on Flipkart using this app? And then ask them to think aloud while they're doing this. That's probably the simplest way to start user research, which is find out a person that represents your target user, and B, give them the product that has to be used, and C, a task that they can perform on that particular product. That's the simplest way to start user research for sure.
Super. That was lovely, Sajal. Thanks for answering that. I will just pick one more question. So questions are flooding, but we will also pick them up in the end, and we will also be answering them live. So request to everyone is Please put your questions on the Q&A option so that we can answer them live and everybody can see the questions as well as the answers. The second question, and it's an interesting one, Sajal, is have the research methodologies used changed or evolved due to the remote nature caused by the pandemic?
No, absolutely. I think great question. And to be honest, when the pandemic hit, we were also set back for maybe a couple of weeks or so, and we were trying to figure out how do we conduct user research, because I always used to think that going to the field and meeting people in person cannot be replaced. And it's true, it cannot be replaced, but there are definitely ways you can work around doing remote user research. And I would say that all these methods that we have been doing in person can also be done remotely. There are some trade-offs that we have to make, but there are also some pros and cons that you can do. And I'll just take one such example, which is this. When we used to do focus group discussion, we used to select cities which were close to each other. So if we chose Delhi, we choose another city which is close to Delhi that we can travel to by car in a couple of hours. But now when we did focus group discussion, we had participants coming from all 4 metros joining at the same time. So what it gave was we could sit at one place and have diversity of views of the whole country in just one discussion. So it's not like everything is lost, but there is always something that you gain and something that you lose. So there are trade-offs to be made.
Great. That was brilliant, Sajal. I think we will take on quite a few of those questions at the end. So please keep asking your questions. And in interest of time, I will hand it back to Sajal.
All right, great. Thanks, Isha. And those were some really interesting questions. Now I'll move on to this section, which is about 3 stories from the field. Here I want to share all these 3 stories are my past experience about how user research brought impact to the product that I was working on. And with that, I will also talk about 3 different methods that I used in those contexts and how you can use that for your own product as well. The first one is, the first story is called as Taking the Middle Path, and no, it has got nothing to do with Gautam Buddha. I'll come to that point later, that what exactly it meant. So back in 2016, I used to work in a company called Savan, which is now called as JioSaavn. And that was the time when Jio had just launched and people had started streaming music on their mobile network. And it was bringing in a lot of traffic. But at that point, we wanted to understand and identify opportunities to increase the engagement further, because obviously there were a lot of competition back then. So we wanted to make sure that the product that we are building, the features that we're building, will lead to better music listening experience and hence lead to high engagement. So we conducted user research, conducted multiple in-depth interviews, identified personas, and with that, we conducted multiple experiments that led to high album streams, and eventually a feature called Mix. It's a story about that. So we started conducting a lot of user research and eventually discovered there are different kind of music listeners. Not a surprise, but we realized that it's a spectrum of music listeners, and even within Savan. And that spectrum can be laid out in one parameter, which is if they are active listeners versus passive listeners. And we realized that on one extreme, there were passionate music listeners who would listen to very specific songs in very specific order. Whereas on the other end, we had indifferent people, indifferent towards music. All they wanted was to listen to music, and it didn't matter which kind of music that they were listening to. So we met all people within this range. So these were the extremes of this range. What we started realizing that different people had different interests depending on which context they were. Sometimes they would be passionate, sometimes they would be dependent, and so on. So I'll just talk about different kind of listeners over here. So the passionate I talked about were very, very specific about the songs and the order in which they played. So they used features like queuing, self-made playlist. Aficionado, on the other hand, selected and downloaded songs and went offline for a long time. So they created their own playlist and had download libraries features being used. Then there were people who were dependent. So these were the people who would use someone else's, either user created playlist or editor created playlist, and then listen to song. And lastly, the indifferent people who would put on the radio and then forget about the music, and they would listen for long hours. So there were basically two groups that were emerging in the product team itself, who said that the new feature to be built should be for passionate music listeners, while the other said, hey, it should be for passive listening or the more indifferent kind of people, because that will lead to high engagement. What we started realizing was that there was one new behavior which was emerging that was called a satisficer. This was the kind of user who was not too passionate, but not too passive as well. They wanted to pick up the song and listen to very specific or not specific, but what similar kind of songs together. So we call these people or the behavior as seed and grow, where people or the user would select a particular song to signify this is the mood that they want to listen to, the song's mood that they want to listen to. And based on that, they expected that more such songs should be shown by the platform. So imagine this, a person selects a song and then they expect the other songs to be picked up by the platform and played in that order. And if the platform selects a wrong song, then they can reorient and bring it back. So what we started seeing was a behavior that we called seed and grow. And we wanted to see if this can be leveraged in some way. I also want to remind you that this was almost 4 or 5 years back. And therefore that was the time when YouTube Premium did not exist. Spotify was not in India. And there were selected few music streaming platforms. And YouTube back then had to put the screen on, and therefore you can't listen to music like this. So therefore, apps like Savan and Ghana were very, very important to people, and they could listen to it passively. So what we did was we started doing certain experiments in order to test this hypothesis. So we picked up some popular single song albums, one of them being Closer, for example. And we said every time a person selects this and plays this for more than 2 times consciously, then we are going to add 20 more songs which are similar to it and see if people come back and listen to this a lot. It was all done very manually. There was no tech behind it. It's a very low-tech Jugaad solution to it. What we realized after running the experiment for 1 whole month is that there was a sustained increase in album streams. That led to verifying that yes, this hypothesis was working well, and this behavior that we identified is somewhere in middle of the passionate and the passive listeners, and we can leverage on this. So we created a feature which was called as color mixes. So you can see over here, orange mix, indigo mix, and so on. If you use Savan back in 2018 and onwards, then you would have seen this feature. So it was essentially a list of 20 songs based on your past history. And that was automatically created playlist based on systemic recommendation of songs which are similar to the song that you have selected. So that was called as a seed song, and the other songs were called as growth songs. So seed and grow was the mantra for this one. And eventually what happened was that this feature was one of the top most used playlist features for users in the app. And we continue to refine the recommendations based on that. So this was one such impact, that we're identifying behavior, doing experiments, and eventually creating a product feature out of it. So that's the end of first story. And I now want to talk about the methods that I used. So the method that I used was in-depth interview. And this is how the in-depth interview looks like. So on one side, you have moderator. On the other side, you have a participant. Usually, we record the session. So you see a recording device as well. There's a discussion guide, which the person is holding in the hand. You may use it, you may not use it, but it's always good to have a discussion guide. And then you try to understand people's needs, behavior, and motivation to know their behavior further. So this is what in-depth interview looks like. When should you use it? So it's usually used in early product development. So when you're trying to understand, hey, what product should be built and for whom should it be built, this is a great method to use this. It's not a good method when you want to understand a large scale of people's responses. So maybe when you're trying to understand a demography, or maybe you're trying to do problem investigation, that's probably not the best method. Also, when you're trying to look at longitudinal understanding, so you want to understand how people shop for a particular product and it takes maybe 1 week or 10 days time to buy, then probably not the best method. So in-depth interview is very versatile. then you can use this method along with other methods, for example, usability and other surveys and so on, to make a very foolproof study. So what are the pros and cons of this particular method? See, advantage is that you get to find the deep desires, motivation, values, attitudes, and memories of people whom you're interacting with. You can go much, much deeper into their behavior, their past memories, and try to investigate this further. You can also build very good rapport with the person because you're doing this conversation one-on-one. The limitation of this is, it is because it's one-on-one conversation, it's not the best method to observe a behavior. So if you want to observe a behavior of a person performing a certain task, then combine this with a usability or a formative evaluation. B, it's very difficult to scale up. A large scale study would always have something like 25 participants, and it's difficult to organize such a large scale study. So you need to understand the sample sizes are going to be usually small. So somewhere close to 12, 15 participants is usually the sample size that we keep. And lastly, users may not recall everything in this 60-minute discussion. So you need to keep that in mind as well. Okay, now that brings me to the second story. The story is called Standing in the User's Shoe. So this is from 2019 when I was working in Flipkart, of course, and working in the fintech team. And we wanted to identify opportunities to offer consumer lending products to people. We did this by conducting focus group discussion in 2 cities. One was in Delhi and one is Bareilly. The impact of this study was, first of all, of course, we got to understand the user's need for credit. But second, which was the more important one, is that it created a culture of user empathy in the whole team, not just the user research design, but product, business, and analytics, and even the developer team, and which I believe was far greater impact than anything else. So coming to the first part, which is to understand the spectrum of credit needs. I'll not go much into detail, but just to highlight that, again, here also we saw extremes of the credit needs, which was right from bare necessities to more discretionary needs. And because we met so many different people from 2 different cities, they talk about different instances of why they borrowed money. And we categorized that into 5 different categories. That led us to identify a few things. One, that based on different needs, based on different reasons why people borrow money, the needs are very different from the credit products that they offer. And the second thing we realized is that if the user comes from a higher income or a smaller family, they tend to be more inclined towards discretionary needs, whereas people coming from lower income and larger family would align on this particular non-discretionary needs. That led us to narrowing down all the needs into 3 different categories, which we called as either emergency needs on one side, lifestyle expenditures in middle, and then long-term aspirations on the last. And we saw that there were very unique things about all these 3 needs, which is that the amount needed for emergency need was lesser, but the urgency was high. Lifestyle, again, somewhere in middle, which is 25,000 to 1 lakh, but the urgency was medium. And the long-term aspirations were 1 lakh and above, and the urgency was lesser. And we realized that all these had very, very distinct requirements. Now, we didn't stop at this point, because if we said, hey, these are the 3 different needs and these are the 3 products to launch, then it would have caused problem about, hey, what exactly has to build and for whom? So the next slide is one of the most important tools that you can use as user researcher to create user empathy. And that is called persona. So what we did was we identified all these user needs and we personified this. What you see over here, Preeti, is a character completely built from a hypothetical character completely built from real data, and who has a backstory to her. There's a proper reasoning behind why she is the way she is, right? It's a real character based on the data that we had observed on the field. So she's 27 years old, works for a company in Pune, and she's married and lives with her husband. She has a need for borrowing money for family vacations, and this is her financial snapshot. So we created a whole character, the background story, so that the people, the stakeholders in our team get to know her very well. And the reason for that is because as human beings, we can empathize with another human being or another living person. Right. So what happened with that is that eventually led to the whole team getting more in the shoes of user. So one such example was that the persona was displayed in the office bay. What you see a display over here is this is a TV, and this is the place where all the product folks used to sit, designers, product managers, data analysts, and everyone. So what started happening was that when anyone would walk by this particular bay, they would ask that, hey, who's this? And everyone would tell the story that, hey, this is Preeti, this is whom we are building the product for. And Preeti would like to have this kind of a feature, she would use this way, and so on. So they knew exactly who to be built for. That's what led to that was me as user researcher, I was able to transfer the needs of user through a persona and a story to all my stakeholders, so they knew about who they are building for, and there was a cohesive understanding amongst all the stakeholders. The second thing was that I made sure that when we went on the field, that all the stakeholders were with me, so that they also experience users' context firsthand. So you see one photograph in which the product manager is interacting with one shopkeeper, trying to understand the EMIs and loans that they offer. Where on the second photo, you see all the product managers sitting and observing the user research that was conducted. What it leads is that then user researcher is not just the person responsible for users' need, but it's the whole team who gets to know about the user's need, and that leads to product innovation. So this is the method that we had used. So this is how the environment looks like. A focus group discussion usually has about 4 to 8 people of the target user group, and they have discussion on particular topics, which is moderated by a user researcher. So in focus group discussion, what usually happens is that you have targeted user groups, and usually it ranges between 3 to 8 people. And usually I go for about 5 participants because it's easy to hold that discussion and hold their attention while the discussion is going on. It's extremely important or essential method to use in foundational research. Early product user research is a very essential method for using in early stages of product development. When not to use it, it's not a great method to observe behavior. So do not go testing your product while doing focus group discussion. And it cannot be also replaced for individuals' usability study or maybe a small scale survey. Do not try to do survey in a focus group discussion. So essentially, focus group discussion is very good when you want to get wide attitudinal responses of people and people's attitude in their opinions of different aspects. Lastly, on advantages and limitations. So focus group is extremely good, very efficient to get responses from more number of people. From a qualitative point of view, it's definitely more efficient in terms of getting wider responses compared to an in-depth interview. And it is also a very good method when you want to uncover some social dynamics among the group. Let's say you want to investigate a group of family or maybe group of friends, or maybe group of sellers, buyers, and so on. So whenever there is a group dynamic being played, it's an extremely good method. The limitations for this is it's not good for behavior finding. It's always good for understanding past instances, past stories, and so on. The next is you need a very experienced moderator, because someone can hijack a discussion, or maybe some participant will not respond. So it's extremely important to have an experienced moderator over here. That brings me to a third story. Now this story is called as A Stitch in Time Saves 9. So this is a story about one of my first projects in Flipkart, where we were trying to investigate Flipkart Plus. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but Flipkart has a program called Flipkart Plus for loyalty. In this particular research, where we wanted to investigate, do formative evaluation of a concept called cash and coins. So if you go on Flipkart right now, you can see that you can pay pay for a product by a particular price, or you can pay by coins as well as a discounted cost. So this was the first time that we were testing up this particular feature. So we did conduct user research in Lucknow and Bangalore. And then we identified some of the problems that user faced, and we modified the design and then launched it. So when we talk about evaluating a particular design, this is how we do it, the formative evaluation I was talking about. So in this particular research, what we did was we created a prototype of a design. At that time, we used software called as InVision, which is nothing but like a browser where you can create stitch together screenshots to make it look like an app together. So we had a clickable prototype of Flipkart app. We asked people to perform tasks on that prototype. For example, can you buy a shoe on this Flipkart app, or can you buy a shirt? And we had 3 such tasks. And we had questions coming to the users and asking them that how will they complete this task. The discussion usually lasted about 60 minutes, and from there we got to understand that what was the people's perception and where they were getting stuck. So one such finding from that particular user research was this: that when we were evaluating this prototype, we realized that when people were reading this particular plus price, they thought that because they're plus members, they are getting a discount, and they're also getting 8 coins along with that, which meant they were confusing. So instead of thinking that this is the price they have to pay, they thought that this is the discount that they're getting and the coins that they're getting along. So we had to make this change, and eventually what you see over here is that we have explicitly called out that this is the amount that you have to pay, and that became clear to user. So it was good that we were able to identify this kind of misinterpretation of the design of the representation of plus price early on before we launched it, else it would have caused a large-scale confusion. So, which brings me to the method that we had used. That's called Formative Usability Evaluation, and this is how the setup looks like. So you have the stakeholders which are sitting on one side of the mirror, and this is a one-way mirror. And on the other side, there's a moderator and a participant who the participant is the one who's performing the task while the moderator is conducting it. And the observers or the stakeholders can observe this from behind the one-way mirror. So that's the setting that it looks like. So when you talk about usability evaluation, it's extremely important step in your formative evaluation or the summative evaluation, which means before launching the product or even after launching the product, both the times it's extremely essential. When not to use it, when you are trying to get some foundational understanding. So if you are still not sure what product to be built, do a foundational research. Don't go out directly with some formative evaluation or summative evaluation. Lastly, what are the pros and cons of this method? So it's probably the cheapest method to do user research. And if you are new to user research, this is where I would suggest you to start. It's extremely easy to conduct, and you can give very high returns on very low effort. This is probably the most efficient user research method that you can use if your product is already live. Why do I say that? Because even 5 to 6 participants can reveal about 80% of usability issues. This is from one of the research papers. So one limitation is that you might not get statistically significant results, but you will get good enough results for your product to be shipped out without any major usability flaws. Okay, so that was about 3 stories and the methods to be chosen. I now want to go to the section which will be more about practical implication. And in next couple of minutes, which is about 5 minutes, I will talk about how you can pick up the right method at what stage and how you can apply that to your own product research. So this is one screen. I would request, if you are really interested, you can take a screenshot and go through it later on. But here's one way to decide which method to use. The first thing you can ask is, which stage is the product at? Is it at a stage where it does not exist? That's the first one. B, you have some ideas and concepts and you want to investigate. These other is product is live and you want to understand how it is doing. And lastly, if there is unusual metric movement. So based on that, you can pick up these methods. So I've listed them down over here. And I've also mentioned these methods at the beginning, which were called as foundational, formative, summative, and lastly, investigative. So these are some of the common methods that you can use. Again, there is no hard and fast rule that these are the methods only that you can use, but these are generally rule of thumb that you can use these methods for these particular stages. Lastly, I'll come to the point on avoiding common pitfalls. So I hope that this small little effort of mine inspired you to conduct your own user research. But if you are planning to go out on field, here are some points that you can keep in mind. The first is, if you are planning to conduct your own research, rely mostly on observing behavior rather than asking opinions. So it's nothing wrong to ask the opinion, but if you want to understand how people use a product, or maybe someone else's product, like a competition's product, it's better you ask them, hey, can you show me how do you use this product? How do you shop online on Flipkart? And so on. So you will get far more insights by observing people's behavior than asking them opinion about, hey, what's your opinion on so-and-so? The second biggest problem is asking leading question. The leading question usually has an answer embedded in itself. For example, do you think you'll get discounts when you click offer zone? So the moment you ask a question like this, people already know that there is an answer embedded to it and they can respond to it. And it's one of the biggest problems I see when people are conducting user research. Third is using jargons or technical terms. Because we come from tech world, we know we are going to use a lot of jargons. So when you're asking questions like, when you try to cancel product on Flipkart, do you go through hamburger menu or my account, something like this? Because the moment you give this kind of options, right, they know exactly what to look out for. You don't want to give away those answers to users. Fourth is asking people to predict the future. And this is a section of, or a set of questions, I call them speculative questions, which is, hey, if we build a XYZ feature, will you start using the app? And this is definitely a very wrong way to ask or getting to know whether you should build a feature or not. The best way is to actually prototype it, create a prototype, give it to the user and observe how they are using it. Last 4 points on this. The next set of mistakes that one can do is to assume that user can answer all the questions. Always go onto the field thinking that user can probably answer questions which is about themselves, but probably not about all over the world, which is that, hey, do you think so-and-so is the best e-commerce app? Or do you think this is the best way to listen to music, or so on? So don't make that assumption. Next is creating a list of close-ended questions rather than laddering. So if you're doing the survey, probably then it's okay to create a close-ended question. But if you're doing an interview, always have an open-ended question where the responses to it could not be like yes and no, binaries, or maybe limited amount of answers. Okay. Seventh is people won't always say what they believe in, right? And this is one of the traps that you can fall into. That you need to come across as a neutral researcher, and otherwise what would happen is that people will give you answers which you are expecting, or maybe which is expected as a norm, right? Social desirability bias. That maybe it is, if you're asking a particular question which generally speaking people don't respond to in certain way, then you need to be very, very careful in asking those questions. So for example, when we were doing a research on consumer lending, we asked that, do you think what do you think about borrowing money? And people said, hey, borrowing money is really wrong. Okay. And then we started asking question more about, hey, have you used EMIs? And they said, yes, of course, we use EMIs. EMIs is great. And we saw that there was this kind of a dichotomy that EMIs were good, but then borrowing money was wrong. So you need to always overcome what kind of social desirability bias might be for a certain question. Different question than you ask, and that's perfectly fine. I would say that there might be times when they may pause, they may take some time to respond, and they may even respond to a different question. But if you know it's going to be valuable, then that's perfectly fine. So I hope all these points were helpful to you, and you took away something important from this whole discussion. Those were all the points that I had from my end, and now I will hand it over to Isha.
Right. So this has been really, really interesting, Sajal. Thank you so much. And you've been speaking for quite some time now. So maybe if you want to grab a glass of water and take a deep breath, feel free to do so while I just talk through a few pointers. Number one, there's lots of questions on the chat window, and some of them have been answered, but we are conscious that some of them have not been answered. This is a Zoom call, which means that we will get a recording of all the questions that you have asked only on the Q&A window. So for the questions that are on the chat window, they might just get missed, but we will still see if we can try to answer those later. That's number one. Number two, there are questions on recordings, presentation, etc. Recordings definitely will be shared on LinkedIn on the Flipkart career site that you see right now, the Flipkart LinkedIn page. So if you haven't followed us, please do it right away, because you will be able to see the recordings on the Flipkart page. We will make sure that we share it as soon as possible. You can also follow us at Live at Flipkart, where we keep posting really interesting stuff. And of course, job postings are all there on flipkartcareers.com as well. So you can take a snapshot of what you see on the screen right now. I'm conscious that we are over time and there are lots of questions, and I'm sure all of you need to move on to other engagements. So what we will do is, for the ones who do want to stick around, we will take another 10 to 15 minutes to pick a few questions that you've asked and answer them live. We will not be able to answer all the questions right now because there's a huge number there. And like I said, the rest of them we will answer on the Flipkart LinkedIn page. So if you haven't followed us yet, please do follow us to see your questions being answered. Sajal, I hope you've taken a little bit of a breather, and I will then jump into a few of the questions which might be relevant to everyone here. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Super. So Sajal, the first question is, hi Sajal, thanks for your time today. So yeah, thank you for me and everyone as well. I pursued my master's right after my bachelor's, and I have 5 years of academic research experience conducting surveys and interviews. I've also worked with agencies on different UX research projects using multiple research methods. Now I'm looking for a full-time role, and the companies I'm applying to ask for 2 to 3 years of full-time experience, which was not at all the case. How can I set my foot in the UX research world? Any tips?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can relate to this question because I also had a long academic career before I jumped into user research. So there are some practical things that I can offer you. First is, in order to get opportunity in product, start doing product user research. As you mentioned that you have done academic research. All I can say from my own experience of doing academic research is it's very, very different. The temperament is different. The objectives are very different. In product user research, the objectives are very different. So I'm not sure how long did you do your master's and where you are in your life stage. But if you're just out of college and you did your master's and all that, I would say that get into an internship. Internship is definitely one of the best ways to do it. We also hire interns from universities, different universities, and we give them opportunity. And that's one great way to show product experience. The second is, if you can't get through that, then look for working in UX research agency. Right now, there's a lot of demand and there are a lot of agencies coming in. From there, you can get experience in some of the research agencies. If not, the last comes is freelance research. There are a lot of startups, a lot of product coming up. So you can work along with them as a freelancer and then gather more experience around it. So the simple answer is gain more experience in product settings. And there are various avenues to do that.
Great, Sajal. That was really, really useful and lovely to see that you could share this from your own personal experience. The next question is, hi, Sajal, how do we initiate this user research where you don't have the flexibility to directly talk to the user, nor conduct any kind of survey or interview? Is there any effective method?
Okay, that's strange. I would really like to know, like, why do they think that they do not have access to users? But let's say if that is the case, then if there are other ways to reach out to users, then try to use it. Probably if you can reach out to them through emails, maybe you can try to invite them for one-on-one discussions, or maybe even try to do remote interviews. So these I would call as the low fidelity ways to get to reach out to users. One interesting method that I'd come across back then was to use tools like usertesting.com, where you can send a link to a participant and they can perform the task which you have written in their own home environment, and they can send you back the recording. So that's another way you can do it. You can send an email to people saying that, hey, this is the task you need to perform on this particular product, and record the session while you do it and send it back to you. So that's one way. The second is doing remote interviews, which is if you can reach out to them and can have question and answer, that would be great. And lastly, surveys are also on the option. So, but I would really like to know, like, in what context is this person asking this question?
Yeah, so I think Madhushri, if you can hear us, if you do want to share the context, that will be great. And Sajal can make sure that we are able to answer you from wherever you were coming from. And I will just quickly, because we have our users dropping out as well, Sajal, I'll just pick two more. And meanwhile, I just want to say there is a poll live on the screen right now. So as you leave, it will be great if you can give us your feedback, because it will really help us to make sure that we continue to improve upon our next editions of OneCast. And of course, one little anecdote as you leave, or little factoid actually as you leave, is BBD is just around the corner. So please do make sure that you're a part of this great event. It starts from 3rd October. And start to build up your cards there. Sajal, I'll just ask 2-3 more questions.
Yeah, can I just pick up 2 or 3 questions which are quick?
Please do that. Go ahead.
Right. So I really like this one. It's called "How does one buy as a solo user researcher in a team?" And I can answer this because in my first company, I was the solo user researcher, and one of the best ways to get early buy-in and build credibility is to do usability testing. So the first time I did the usability testing, my manager wasn't aligned, and they thought that there is no point in doing that usability. But I went ahead and did that, and I was able to find usability bugs which were very, very crucial to the paid version of the product, and that brought in a lot of credibility to me as a solo user researcher. So I think if you are a solo user researcher in a team and you're new to that particular team, start with a usability evaluation of their key products, key tasks. That will give you a lot of credibility. There's one very interesting question about prototype developed apart from A/B testing. So I think evaluation is extremely. In fact, I would suggest that even before you go on to A/B testing, do formative evaluation with just 5 or 6 participants. What happens with that is, let's say you have 2 or 3 prototypes, and all 3 of them have a very unique way of interaction or task which is set out in the product. So what happens with that is you get to know that what people are doing. Or how the people's perception is, and you can actually come up with a prototype which is version C, which is best of both the prototypes. So let's say if you have A and B, you pick up the best version of both of them and make another prototype called C, and then you test this and optimize that. So you can actually come to a more optimum set of prototypes that you can test with formative evaluation. And that's one way you can eliminate even before going into A/B testing. So that's something that we have done multiple times in Flipkart as well. Maybe I can pick up just 1 or 2 questions. This is one interesting one called "Any tips for doing user research for the tier 3 cities?" So I would like to tell that in past 1.5 to 2 years, we have been doing a lot of user research in tier 2, tier 3 cities. And I was also surprised to see that we were able to do this remotely. So we work along with agencies who help us in recruiting these users, and they have been phenomenal in making sure that the participants that we reach out to have very good internet connection. So they make sure they recharge the data pack, and they make sure that they are able to do the video call with us, and we can ask questions to them. So one thing I would say is that work along with research, user recruitment agencies who will take the effort to make sure that the participants don't drop off and they have good internet connections. So that's that. And I would probably take up the last one, which is a very interesting one. Is foundational same as generative research? I would say, yeah, you can put the generative research also in this bucket of foundational. So essentially, when you're trying to do foundational research, you are trying to understand the problem area and the users. And from that, it is going to inform you for formative evaluation. So yes, a good conclusion of foundational research is that it should generate a lot of ideas and concepts for you to build products. So yeah, I would say that you can call it a good conclusion of foundational research is a good generative study. I think I'll take a pause here. Isha, I think we have answered quite a lot of questions.
Yes, Sajal, I think thank you so much. We are already quite over time. So I would just like to say thank you to everyone for sticking around, the 130 people who are on the call. And I see some of you still raising your hands. If you do have any critical questions or thoughts, you can put it on the chat window saying